Welcome to the second session, and this afternoon we have presentations from Arnoldo Vázquez Gómez, María Ordoñez Trujano, Nobbs-Thiessen, and Sam Boucher. I will be giving all of their bios now, and then they will be presenting. The first two people will be presenting in Spanish, and there will be a translation running on the screen so you can follow along while you're reading. And then we'll do what we did this morning, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. I am not a simultaneous interpreter, but if you ask your questions in English, but they're about something in Spanish, I can do that and translate on the other end, although it will not be perfect. So, our first presenter, Arnoldo Vázquez Gómez, received his BA and MA in Regional History from the Autonomous University of Sinaloa in Mexico. And his MA thesis focused on the migration of Mennonites to northern Mexico from 1922 to 1926. He is currently completing his long-standing research in Mennonite history through a doctoral program at the Autonomous Metropolitan University in Mexico City. His dissertation is focused on processes of modernization and globalization and their effects on the Mennonite community. María Eugenia Ordoñez received her BA in Church History from Denver University and her MA in Social History from the Autonomous University of Sinaloa. Her research areas include the history of the church in Latin America, and she has explored several lines of investigation about the immigration of religious groups in Mexico, especially the Presbyterian and Methodist churches in northern Mexico. She's currently working on a research project with Arnoldo Vázquez Gómez on the social and economic history of Mennonites in the state of Chihuahua. Nobbs-Thiessen is the chair in Mennonite Studies and assistant professor of history here at the University of Winnipeg. He's the editor of the Journal of Mennonite Studies and the co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. His first book, Landscapes of Migration, is excellent. I recommend it. And it examines how indigenous Andeans, Mennonites, and Okinawans took part in Bolivia's colonization of its lowland frontier, an initiative known as the March to the East. And Sam Boucher is a second-year PhD student in history at the University of Iowa, and he primarily investigates Low German Mennonite colonies in Latin America, and his main focus is the transnational network of Mennonites and the main drivers of Mennonite economic success. And we're going to be doing 15 to 20-minute presentations, and I will remind you when your time is up. So, let's get started.
Buenas tardes. Le doy muchas gracias por esta invitación al doctor Nobbs-Thiessen como parte de la institución de Winnipeg University y a la Fundación PLET. A todo su personal, encabezado por la doctora Friesen, y doy gracias a ustedes por estar acompañándonos en esta tarde aquí. Lo que voy a exponer esta tarde son dos factores que hicieron más posible el proceso de inmigración a México. Esos dos factores tuvieron que ver con el papel del ferrocarril y también con el papel de la prensa en México. Y voy a exponer esto porque me ha llamado mucho la atención la manera o el título que tiene esta conferencia. Muchas veces uno va a una conferencia a leer un trabajo y la conferencia se acaba, pero pocas veces hay una reflexión sobre esas cuestiones que se hablan en las conferencias. Y me llamó mucho la atención la manera en cómo el título de esta conferencia habla sobre las reflexiones. Creo que tengo una hora, doctor. 15 minutos. No se preocupen, voy a ser muy breve, ¿ok? Y sobre eso, no solamente quiero hablar sobre los dos factores, sino quiero traer a colación una pequeña reflexión de dónde se mueve este proceso de inmigración en la agenda social de nuestro país. En ese año, en ese periodo fue crucial, el periodo de 1922 a 1930, en la historia de mi país, de nuestro país, y cómo este proceso de immigration va y justo se inserta en ese movimiento de coyuntura, ¿ok? Y sobre eso va a hablar la ponencia, ¿ok? Bueno, el papel del ferrocarril en el proceso de inmigración menonita. El ferrocarril todo el tiempo ha jugado un papel muy, muy importante en la historia de México. Explicar la historia de México sin la presencia del ferrocarril es punto menos de imposible para entenderla. En el régimen de Porfirio Díaz, el ferrocarril fue fundamental para lograr el proyecto de nación que se necesitaba en México. Y en el proceso de la revolución, el ferrocarril jugó también un papel muy importante en la lucha armada, pero en la reconstrucción de la economía nacional. El general Álvaro Obregón mira el papel que juega el ferrocarril en esto, y ante la importancia que tiene para él la inmigración menonita, él incorpora este instrumento del ferrocarril para en un momento dado determinar y que sea un factor fundamental para el transporte de las familias menonitas, pero no solamente para el transporte de las familias menonitas. Si gusta darle la otra, ajá, por favor. Ajá. ¿Sí? No está cooperando, no importa.
Mejor esos menonitas tienen la idea correcta.
Sí, no se preocupe. Sí, ok, ya. Ajá. Bien, a la otra, por favor. Sí, next, please. Entonces, el ferrocarril fue un instrumento sumamente importante en el contexto de la sociedad mexicana para cuando llegan los inmigrantes menonitas. Si gusta, por favor, a la otra. Sin embargo, el ferrocarril no solamente fue un instrumento que transportó familias menonitas, sino que jugó un papel donde la estructura del ferrocarril, la dirección de ferrocarriles mexicanos fue usada como un medio de interconexión entre una dependencia federal y otra dependencia federal. ¿Para qué? Para apresurar y para agilizar este movimiento de la inmigración menonita. Los trenes mexicanos, una vez que estaban las familias en México, no solamente sirvieron para transportar a las familias y a los objetos de las familias, sino que sirvieron para implementar una logística, un sistema de interconexión entre las dependencias federales de México, y ese sistema permitió que el proceso de inmigración en las instituciones mexicanas fuera de una manera más ágil, y fue un motivo en que las trabas burocráticas o las murallas burocráticas fueron eliminadas para que este proceso se agilizara, porque el general Álvaro Obregón y el gobierno mexicano, ellos estaban conscientes de que el proceso tenía que ser de una manera muy rápida por la realidad que se estaba viviendo en México. Next, por favor. Desde esta posición, el 8 de febrero de 1923, se crea el Departamento de Colonización por parte de los ferrocarriles mexicanos. No solamente era una oficina que operaba máquinas, sino era una oficina que tenía una agenda, que tenía una función, que esta función estaba enfocada a interrelacionar y a dirigir un sistema ágil a través del interior del gobierno, pero este sistema estaba interconectado con los consulados que estaban en Estados Unidos y que estaban en Canadá, pero también con los consulados que estaban en Europa. ¿El otro, por favor? Los documentos en los que baso mi investigación están localizados en el Archivo General de la Nación. Y esos documentos hablan cómo en muchas ocasiones los agentes de colonización, tanto mexicanos como extranjeros, estaban en contacto con el gobierno y con las dependencias gubernamentales por medio de esta oficina. Y cuando había algún problema, estas oficinas, por lo general, tocaban a la puerta para que apresuraran los trámites para poder acelerar su llegada a México o para poder hacer uso de los recursos que se enviaban desde Canadá a través de Estados Unidos para llegar a este país, el país de destino que era México. Adelante, por favor. En esta exposición me tocó analizar a mí, ver los primeros carriles, máquinas, donde se transportan las personas de Ciudad Juárez hasta México. Hay una cuestión muy importante. Los delegados menonitas contrataron 2 compañías que estaban en Estados Unidos, más sin embargo, al llegar a la frontera de Estados Unidos, las máquinas cambiaban. Los vagones eran los mismos, pero las máquinas eran diferentes. Y en el primer viaje que se tiene registro en el Archivo General de la Nación, está en la partida de 9 trenes que transportan a las primeras familias menonitas que llegan a San Antonio de los Arenales. La siguiente, por favor. Esos trenes transportaban diversas cosas. No solamente transportaban a las personas ni a la maquinaria, sino también transportaban bienes de las personas, como era el caso de vacas, animales, caballos, y era una transportación de todos los enseres de las familias menonitas. Está localizado en el Archivo General de la Nación de la Ciudad de México, todos los registros conforme a eso. Para 1922 se habían establecido alrededor de 3,000 menonitas en la región de Bustillos, pero al terminar 1927 la cantidad había llegado casi a los 10,000 menonitas que habían emprendido aquella proceso de inmigración, y que el ferrocarril había sido un factor muy, muy importante. Siguiente, por favor. Ahora quiero hablarles de otro actor muy importante en este proceso, la prensa, el papel de la prensa. Y voy a concluir quiero hacer una reflexión final. La prensa jugó un papel muy importante en este periodo. Si gusta, por favor, doctor. La prensa en el periodo del general Álvaro Obregón tenía una función muy específica. Esa función consistía en dar a conocer la agenda del gobierno, en dar a conocer el propósito del gobierno para la sociedad e influir en la sociedad por ese proyecto de gobierno de un nuevo régimen que estaba emergiendo. Si gusta, por favor. Para la cuestión del proceso de inmigración, hubo 2 periódicos en Chihuahua que se enfocaron en ese proceso. Uno es el periódico El Porvenir, que estaba localizado en Monterrey, y el otro periódico era el periódico Independiente de Chihuahua. Si gusta, por favor, doctor. Estos 2 periódicos en realidad no tuvieron una labor de información a la sociedad objetiva como era todo el proceso, sino que estos tuvieron una labor propagandística. Hicieron una labor de crear a la imagen de los menonitas como personas que eran trabajadoras, que iban a impulsar el desarrollo de la región, y personas que eran necesarias para el país. Si gusta, por favor. Tanto el diario de Chihuahua como el periódico El Porvenir, durante 1922 a 1924, estuvieron constantemente informando a la sociedad chihuahuense de que el proceso de inmigración era un proceso que tenía a venir a bien a la sociedad mexicana. Era un proceso que era para traer un progreso a la región, Más sin embargo, estos periódicos ocultaban que había múltiples diferencias en este proceso migratorio en cuanto a lo que opinaba el gobierno federal y a lo que opinaba el gobierno estatal. Si gusta, por favor, pasar. En el fondo, lo que estos dos periódicos hicieron, ellos hicieron algo muy común que era muy frecuente en el periodismo mexicano y que hasta el día de hoy se practica muchas veces. Ellos seguían una estrategia del gobierno federal porque había una dificultad con el gobierno del estado, con el gobernador Enríquez, porque él tenía un propio proyecto de inmigración al interior del estado y ese proyecto chocaba con el proyecto del general Álvaro Obregón. Y ante eso, viendo Álvaro Obregón las dificultades que había a nivel estatal y las dificultades que había en la política, el general Álvaro Obregón hizo uso del contrato de esta prensa, de esta parte de la prensa, para que estos periódicos dieran una imagen positiva de la llegada de los procesos de inmigración, pero no explicaban a fondo lo que estaba oculto. En realidad lo que estaba oculto es que había profundas diferencias a nivel regional y muchos sectores de la sociedad chihuahuense, muchos sectores que tenían que ver con la agenda política, muchos sectores que tenían que ver con campesinos que habían venido de la revolución, estaban un poco en contra de estos procesos, de estas políticas de Álvaro Obregón. Hasta aquí termino y quisiera dar unas reflexiones finales para si me ayuda a traducir. ¿Sí? 2 minutos más. Okay. Si gusta me ayuda a ver. ¿Sí? Okay. Hay un historiador que se llama Henri Pirenne. Okay. Henri Pirenne.
Henri Pirenne, a historian.
Ajá, es un historiador francés.
Ah, he's French.
Ajá. Ya.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe.
Y este historiador dice que la historia no puede entenderse por los grandes acontecimientos.
And so this historian sustains that you can't understand what's going on just at a large scale.
Ajá. Y otro historiador italiano,
and this Italian historian,
que se llama
Carlos Ginzburg,
ajá, él habla de algo que se llama microhistoria.
and he talks about microhistory.
Y él dice algo así.
And he says something like this.
Si tú miras los grandes procesos,
and if you only look at the large processes
en un país, en una región,
in a country or in a region,
y no miras las cuestiones pequeñas,
and you don't look at small everyday matters,
las cuestiones locales,
local questions,
estás perdiendo muchas cosas buenas por mirar.
you are losing a lot of good things that you could be looking at.
El proceso de historia mennonita
And so the Mennonite history process,
es un proceso que se dio a nivel regional.
and this is a regional process, and that's in the Mexican
En un
context,
principio.
at the beginning.
Pero ese proceso
But this process
es parte
is a part of
de un proceso que se estaba dando en toda la nación.
something that was happening throughout the entire country.
Y aparentemente era un proceso inmigratorio más.
And there was an additional immigration or migration process,
Pero las repercusiones que trajo al interior de la nación
but the repercussions that this had on the interior of the country, which in Mexico means anything that isn't the capital,
no solamente en la economía,
not only in the economy,
sino en la política
on a political level
y en lo social,
and social level,
ha marcado la sociedad mexicana.
has really had a profound effect on Mexico.
Álvaro Obregón inició el México moderno.
And so Álvaro Obregón began the modern Mexican project as a nation.
Es el México moderno que tenemos hoy en día.
The modern Mexico that we have today.
Y él apostó todo su capital político que tenía para apoyar este proceso.
And he used up or bet on all of his political capital on this particular process.
Y él tuvo muchas oposiciones
And a lot of people opposed him,
en lo político y en lo económico,
politically and economically,
por otros sectores de la sociedad mexicana.
from a lot of other sectors in Mexico.
Pero él sabía lo importante que era este proceso de inmigración
But he knew that this immigration process would be really important
para el proyecto del México moderno.
to develop Mexico as a modern country.
Y quiero hacer esa reflexión en esta tarde.
And that's what I want all of you to walk away with, that reflection.
Muchas gracias por su amabilidad.
Muchas gracias. Y sí, ya. Para la siguiente ponencia, y el doctor Nobbs-Thiessen va a listar las cosas tecnológicas. Pero puedes empezar a hablar y él va a arreglar las cosas.
Bien. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Okay. Mi nombre es María Eugenia Ordoñez y hemos venido desde la Ciudad de México, Los Mochis, en la Universidad Sinaloa, la UAS. Vamos a hablar nosotros en este momento de los rasgos, trazos y usos de la diplomacia mexicana durante la diáspora menonita hacia México en 1922 y 1924. La llegada de los primeros colonos menonitas, 8 de marzo de 1922, irrumpió como un acontecimiento sin igual en la polvorienta villa de San Antonio de los Arenales. Llegaba a aquellas familias, hombres, mujeres, niños, ancianos, aquel crucial 8 de marzo de 1922. ¿Cuáles fueron los factores que influyeron y que impulsaron este proceso inmigrante? ¿Qué intención había en el nuevo régimen para avalar la inmigración de esta colonia? Las respuestas están en el siguiente momento. Las razones. Terminando el proceso armando de la revolución, el ascenso al poder de la facción obregonista y del grupo Sonora, el nuevo régimen se enfrentaba a una nueva realidad y a un reto desafiante. El presidente Obregón se enfrentó en la enorme tarea de consolidar un nuevo Estado que diera una respuesta a los requerimientos de los distintos grupos sociales que componían la sociedad, por lo cual se enfocarían en la tarea y reconstruir el país económicamente y darle un nuevo proyecto político, tomando en cuenta que durante el conflicto bélico la economía del país y las infraestructuras había quedado destrozada. Desde esta perspectiva, el problema agrario presentaba para el presidente Álvaro Obregón una importante disyuntiva. Su modelo consistía en impulsar las técnicas agrícolas, mecanizar los cultivos y diversificarlos, fomentar el desarrollo a las pequeñas propiedades, introducir en suma a la agricultura moderna, ganado, tierras, al desierto y a los pantanos tropicales, sembrando las grandes extensiones consideradas hasta entonces no cultivables. Desde esta posición se tornó la idea de la escasez de población en el país y por lo tanto la necesidad de traer colonos extranjeros. La colonización tomó viso de un gran proyecto federal asumiendo en el mismo presidente. A pesar de que durante el proceso de la Revolución Mexicana se había desarrollado un discurso nacionalista y anti-extranjero, existía un consenso entre los jefes revolucionarios sobre los beneficios de la inmigración extranjera para el desarrollo. Obregón sabía que la transformación del labrador mexicano en agricultor moderno era punto menos que imposible, porque significaba la distribución de la tierra, la introyección de las mentes de una cultura agrícola y la modernización en seres productivos. La modernidad y el progreso implicaba el crear políticas que favorecían el desarrollo de las relaciones capitalistas. Obregón veía en este punto la recuperación y despegue económico de la nación y a su vez la desconsolidación del Estado nacional. La agricultura fue el sector económico más dañado durante la lucha armada, de tal manera que el nuevo régimen lanzaría una serie de propuestas a través de la Secretaría de Agricultura, 11 de enero de 1921, y designar a los cónsules mexicanos en el extranjero como sus agentes de colonización. Desde esta perspectiva, el nuevo régimen lanzaría una serie de propuestas con el fin de fomentar la inmigración extranjera en nuestros países. Después de este enfoque, que se traducía el genuino interés del gobierno postrevolucionario para darle cabida a este grupo inmigrante menonita. Sobre estos intentos del régimen y sobre la estrategia diplomática hablaremos enseguida. La estrategia y la labor diplomática para impulsar el proyecto de inmigración obregonista. Obregón no habría de escatimar esfuerzos y recursos para su anhelada empresa y su sueño migratorio. Y si desde el principio la diplomacia fue una vía que enarboló como estrategia fundamental en su relación con los países extranjeros, ya que dada su precaria situación de legitimidad internacional, buscó entablar por medio de esta las relaciones que se habían deteriorado. Durante el proceso revolucionario, menester es aclarar que esta experiencia vivida dotaba el nuevo régimen de una corpus y una praxis diplomática ya encarrilada y que basaba su accionar sobre una serie de bases consulares establecida en el extranjero y en el amparo del ejército diplomático. Se formaría una política tendiente a impulsar por todos los medios a su alcance para consolidar el proyecto de la inmigración de los colonos extranjeros y particularmente con los grupos menonitas. Para la realización de este proyecto gubernamental, la tarea se abordó desde dos ámbitos. Por un lado, desde las instancias gubernamentales internas, como la Secretaría de Agricultura, la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, pasando por la Secretaría de Gobernación. Por otro lado, desde exterior, haciendo uso para ello la amplia red consular, ubicada en las distantes ciudades de Estados Unidos y Canadá, hasta aquellas localizadas en los países europeos. Para tal efecto y cumplimiento de este se dio por disposición gubernamental bajo la Secretaría de Agricultura el 2 de marzo de 1922. La creación del Departamento de Tierras y de Localización, que aunque dependía, como los dijimos anteriormente, de la Secretaría de Agricultura, tenía una amplia autonomía enfocada en mantener una relación activa con las diversas instancias consulares en el exterior. Formando desde la iniciativa presidencial, dicho departamento gubernamental realizó durante los años 1922 a 1925 una ágil y febril actividad enfocada en este propósito, como lo demuestra el siguiente telegrama. Sin embargo, lo más sorprendente de esta disposición gubernamental era que sustentaba en una ley porfirista que databa del 15 de diciembre de 1886 y que no solo promovía la inmigración de colonos extranjeros hacia el exterior, a la nación mexicana, sino que daba toda clase de facilidades para hacerse acompañar de todos sus enseres y andamiajes, como bien lo hacía señalar los funcionarios del régimen obregonista. Dicha la ley en su artículo 7 concedía a los colonos que se establecieran en la República excepción de los derechos de importación para instrumentos de labranza, herramienta, máquinas, enseres, materiales de construcción para sus habitantes, muebles de uso y animales de cría y de raza, motivo por el cual se reforzó dicha legislación el 9 de agosto de 1923, con el fin de fomentar la colonización extranjera en la República Mexicana, donde se faculta a la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores para eximinar el pago de los derechos por certificación de factura consulares a los extranjeros. Dicha la ley de manifestación de inmediato a las instancias consulares más activas en la recepción y paso de inmigrantes menonitas, como era el consulado de Laredo, Texas, ya que en un facsimil girado al responsable de dicho consulado se le hace mención de dicha disposición de esta exonerante total en el pago de impuesto por parte del gobierno mexicano. Por otra parte, cada uno de los consulados asentados en los pasos fronterizos de este flujo migratorio se encargaría de girar órdenes, los encargados de las aduanas fronterizas circunscritas en su jurisdicción para darle una agilidad a los trámites correspondientes tanto en lo concerniente a la excepción de impuestos de los bienes importados por los mismos, así como las disposiciones fiscales producto de ello. Tal era el caso en el que el cónsul de Iglipax le notificaba mediante oficio directo el 22 de enero de 1923 al oficial mayor encargado de la Subsecretaría de Relaciones Exteriores dicha operación consular. El papel de los agentes consulares durante los años de 1923 al año 1924 y hasta mediados de 1925 se dio el lapso de registraron el mayor número de inmigrantes menonitas hacia territorio mexicano, y durante este periodo de tiempo el papel de los consulados en el extranjero, así como sus agentes consulares, fue determinante para este proceso. El proyecto del general Obregón pasaba por usar las redes consulares para difundir su programa de inmigración e inmiscuir agentes consulares que estarían facultados para llevar a cabo, los cuales tenía como antecedente la labor de cabildeo que había realizado ante organizaciones como la Cámara de Comercio, medios de difusión y legislatura estatales en el interior del país americano durante el proceso de negociación hacia el reconocimiento del régimen obregonista, labor que había sido fundamental para que estos organismos pusieran una agenda de presión hacia el Congreso y la presidencia americana para que se reconociera el nuevo gobierno mexicano, y que sentó un procedente del trabajo diplomático de dichos organismos consulares más allá de las fronteras mexicanas, así como fecha del 22 de marzo de 1922, el presidente Álvaro Obregón giraba un acuerdo presidencial por medio del cual establecía una manera provisional. Una iniciativa de ley tendiente a los cónsules de México ejercieron como agentes de colonización con la finalidad de facilitar la concesión a favor de los colonos y de las franquicias establecidas por el acuerdo presidencial del 27 de enero de 1921. Para ello quedaba facultado con cargo directo a las partidas de presupuesto e ingreso de la Secretaría de Agricultura y Fomento, recalcando las facultades que tenía. 1. Orden de pasaje de segunda clase a bordo de las líneas nacionales y recibir de los colonos la familia de estos. 2. Órdenes para que los ferrocarriles nacionales hagan el pasaporte de los equipajes de los colonos. 3. Para que las aduanas respectivas permitieran la introducción al paso de los mencionados equipajes y cargados los derechos aduanales a las partidas del presupuesto de la Secretaría de Agricultura y Fomento, previniendo las dificultades o retrasos en las maquinarias burocráticas con el fin de agilitar esta labor estaban facultados por decreto para que los agentes consulares tuvieran una comunicación directa con la Secretaría de Agricultura en lo relacionado a cumplir con dichas disposiciones, como lo hemos mencionado en el primer afluente de Mennonitas. Se dio en el año 1922, pero en los 3 años siguientes la campaña en el exterior fue igual de intensiva. La insensatez y laboriosidad agenda diplomática del gobierno posrevolucionario entre 1922 y 1924 se intensificó a partir de los resultados que estaban gestionando en las negociaciones de inmigración con los grupos menonitas, labor que se mira reflejada en la formación de una comisión bilateral tendiente a agilitar y garantizar no solo el buen fin de flujo migratorio, sino que respaldara el asentamiento de los mismos. En esta incansable tarea, por un lado, estaban los consulados directamente ubicados en las ciudades fronterizas, principalmente en Eagle Pass, Laredo y así como El Paso, Texas, los cuales se encargaban de ejercer una coordinación con las agencias y aduanas para expandir los permisos y concesiones, así como los certificados, y llevar directamente el registro de número de familias que entraban al territorio mexicano y notificar periódicamente a la Secretaría de Agricultura y Fomento. Ejemplo claro de lo escrito consta en los distintos oficios y telegramas que tanto las sedes. Me da mucho gusto estar con ustedes y hablar de este medio de la inmigración de los menonitas. En este momento yo quiero darle gracias al doctor Ben y a todo su séquito por esta invitación. Cordialmente les agradezco esta atención y que les haya sido de mucha utilidad. Muchísimas gracias.
¿Vamos bien?
Hello again, everyone. So I want to start off this talk, Permanence or Perpetual Motion, with an image from the consular process that María was just describing in great detail about the gathering of photos and information about arriving families. So here in 1925, we have Franz and Sarahib, both in their 30s, being registered on June 17th, 1925, as they came in at the El Paso Ciudad Juarez crossing. They had 6 children in tow. The Weebs were among the thousands of Mennonites, as we've heard many times today, who headed south to Mexico from Canada in the 1920s in response to compulsory English language education. The migration of the 20s would stand as a new instance of diasporic creation for a community already shaped by previous waves of migration. With it emerged a Latin American Mennonite diaspora, sometimes referred to as the Canadier or LGM for short, Low German Mennonites. Scholars define, of course, diaspora in different ways, but commonly emphasize a movement of dispersal to 2 or more locations, a degree of alienation from their host lands, and ongoing connections to homelands left behind, sometimes with real or imagined prospects of return. In addition to that, a multi-generational self-awareness. With this framework in mind, this paper asks, what were the consequences of that migration a century ago? Permanence or perpetual motion? The answer is probably going to be profoundly unsatisfying to those in the room, because both permanence and perpetual motion, as we could guess, prevail among this diaspora. Certainly the celebrations to mark the arrival of Mennonites in Mexico, held this summer, I know Kenneth was there, point to this idea of permanence, the creation of a new and enduring migrant community as a result of that move. The process of commemoration, in this case, always performative, serves as it does for other migrant communities who also mark anniversaries through the erection of monuments and the gathering of community members and state authorities as a sort of central claim to place, belonging, continuity, stability. Yet the construction of an enduring Mennonite community in northern Mexico has paradoxically been marked by continuous individual and collective departures that we've already heard about today. The products of those departures significantly outnumber the settler descendants who remained behind in places like Mexico. The sub-migrations and the sub-sub-migrations and the sub-sub-sub-migrations of Mennonites from Mexico to Belize, Bolivia, Argentina, Paraguay, Colombia, recently to Peru, as well as the internal migrations within specific nations, are complex, as are the motivations for these migrations, which, though often having a prominent cause, often highly conflictual, are not easy to separate. In the same migration to Bolivia in 1968, famously over the use of rubber tires on tractors, migrants also told contemporary reporters and later recounted in their own oral histories that the issue was over perhaps the lack of rain in Chihuahua and the resistance to irrigated agriculture, or due to land scarcity and conflict with agrarian leaders. Sometimes they would even switch script in mid-interview or mid-sentence. Another Bolivia-bound Mennonite interviewed as he was preparing his travel visa in Mexico City in 1968 was almost blasé about his own plans, noting simply that, quote, "Mennonites need to travel from time to time. We are accustomed to it." Adding still more complexity to this history of expansion and the establishment of new permanent colonies throughout Latin America has been the continuous migration, often figured as a return, of Mennonites from Latin American colonies to multiple destinations in Canada and the United States. 30 years after that opening portrait was taken of the Weeb family crossing at El Paso, the Winnipeg Free Press offered a portrait of one such returnee family, the Walls. 29 in truck, 2,000 miles, not bad. So 23-year-old Aaron Wall from Cuauhtemoc, his 22-year-old wife Helen, 2 children, David and John, were among 100 or so Mennonites brought into Manitoba by Peter Sawatsky, a fellow Mennonite from Mexico, with a rented home in Winkler, Manitoba, for that purpose in the summer of 1966. Sawatsky was later fined for transporting folks without a proper permit. I'm not sure what sort of permit you get for that, but he didn't have it. Aaron's brother David had already traveled up to Canada with Sawatsky earlier in the summer, and the Wall family paid $50 per adult. The kids got to ride free for a less than glamorous week-long trip with 26 others, or I guess 25 others, I think my math is off there, in the back of a flatbed truck with an improvised wooden camper and a latrine. They walked across the US-Mexico border at El Paso and reboarded and came across the Canada-US border at Emerson, where Wall, whose parents were born in Canada, was issued a 6-month visa by a border guard who perhaps unsurprisingly also spoke Low German. Wall had made $1.50 a day in Mexico as a welder, and he would earn that much in an hour in Canada, though many of the other migrants ferried by Sawatsky that summer would certainly have earned less harvesting sugar beets. Members of Wall's home community in Chihuahua would migrate to Bolivia that very next year. So how do we understand these simultaneous migrations, both north and south? MCC worker George Reimer, quoted by David Quiring, who's written about this Canadian connection in the past, put it succinctly: permanent migrations to Canada tend to indicate the preeminence of economic considerations over religious, while migrations to South America suggest the reverse. Royden Lowen adds to this picture, writing a bit more lengthily, that no matter their origin, these migrations to Canada differed from the church-ordered group migration southward and within the South. The move northward was a haphazard, economically driven, and individually ordered chain migration. The migration northward was more difficult also than the migration southward in another respect, for it entailed a sharp break with the very goals of the first immigrants from Canada in the 1920s. It marked an abandonment of the dreams of the migrants' parents and grandparents. At a broad level, I think these are very useful characterizations for the sort of calculations that folks like the Wall family were making when they headed north. However, such migrations were not always permanent, nor did they always represent a break in the way that those quotes might imply. Now, I have the world's crudest schema here, but if the 1966 to 68 period seemed to represent 3 fateful choices which Mennonites could make: remain in Mexico amid religious change and economic uncertainty, move to Canada for work, or move to Bolivia for religious convictions, individual families may have experimented with all 3 choices and often done so more than once. A Bolivian Mennonite, Abe, there's a lot of Bolivian Mennonites named Abe, I interviewed, so he is very anonymous as he could be, described his own experience in these years. Born in 52, his family had briefly and disastrously moved to Belize in 1959. Tina talked about that move. And upon returning to Mexico, Broke had migrated north to Canada. First with his father and then with his brother, Abe went north 12 times over 20 years, from 1963 to 1983. In the early period of his migration, the family would typically return to Mexico over winter to avoid the reach of the school system and maintain sort of dual household farms. The one winter he spent in Canada as a youth, he remembers being forced to attend school at the age of 14. They enrolled him in grade 1, but he notes that he made it up to grade 5 by the end of the year. Though he spent years in Canada, Abe described his unhappiness or his alienation for thinking about diasporas with life there, and his growing dissatisfaction with life in Mexico, undergoing modernization, highly conflictive in those years. This eventually, despite pressure from his parents to remain in Mexico, led Abe to belatedly move to Bolivia in the 1980s, where he rejoined many of his childhood neighbors in a horse and buggy Mennonite colony who had migrated there some 20 years earlier. Interestingly, however, Abe's brother Peter, who also worked alongside Abe in the greenhouse industry in Leamington on their early adult forays to Canada, was also living part-time in Bolivia. However, he had joined an evangelical church, initially living in a colony that had maintained conservative dress, but eventually accepted a car, and he commuted seasonally, almost like a modern Mennonite snowbird, between his farm in Bolivia, which he operated, and a greenhouse he also operated in Ontario. His brother Abe, to return to Abe's wife, meanwhile, though one of 15 children, was the only one in her family in Bolivia, with the rest of her siblings in Mexico, Canada, and the US, both in Seminole and in Kansas, probably liberal Kansas. Abe's story indicated a move north based on economic need and a move south based on religious conviction might be contained within one individual trajectory. Peter's story suggested a move south was no longer the exclusive provenance of the traditionalists. Another Abe, right, I interviewed in the same horse and buggy colony in Bolivia, who kept an Ontario license plate I always like to refer to in his tool shed in Bolivia, told me that he bought his property there with money he and his family had earned while in Ontario in 2001. They lost their first property in Bolivia's Santa Rita colony due to drought-induced debt. With the temporary move, he effectively used northern wages to reinforce and sustain a traditional southern life. The practice was not without its perils, however. This Abe's children, who had spent their formative years in Canada while the family was saving money to buy their property in Bolivia, were eager to return for work. The oldest already had, the next in line seemed eager to do so, and were thinking about perhaps moving permanently. Even Abe himself confided to me that he was, quote, thinking about leaving to go to Canada and to live there my whole life. But I don't think I will go, he continued. When I asked him why, he said, the problem is that the whole family doesn't want to go. My wife is bothered by what the ministers say, that if we go there, we will be thrown out of the religion. The stories then of the two Abes don't necessarily challenge the North economic, South religious framework offered by Lowen, but they do indicate that across individual lives and in between generations, a persistent mobility is part of the imaginary possible for many in the Latin American Mennonite diaspora. I'm just going to pause for a sip of water. As exceptional as this transnational imaginary might be, we would be wise to avoid considering this as especially unique. Mennonite studies folks are always guilty of a certain exceptionalism. Other mobile subjects, though experiencing differing levels of racism or xenophobia as they cross borders, followed similarly complex trajectories in the 20th century, sometimes not just proceeding from one destination to the other in a linear fashion, but engaging in multiple comings and goings. Students in my migration history seminar I'm teaching right now will be familiar with a number of these examples. We could turn to one of a Puerto Rican woman named Rosanna, part of a highly mobile diaspora, interviewed by scholar Elizabeth Aranda. She'd been born in Puerto Rico, attended schooling in the US, moved to Brazil where she was married, returned to Puerto Rico, found economic opportunities not satisfying, returned to the US in 3 different locations and across 3 states. After a divorce, she returned to Puerto Rico again, and as she was being interviewed, she was packing her bags to go back to the US mainland once more. When communities in particular have access to mobility across these borders, these sort of comings and goings are not unique. One additional example with a very surprising connection directly to Low German Mennonites is that of a Trinidadian woman, Bonnie Hector. She spent her childhood near Port of Spain, Trinidad, before migrating as part of the Windrush generation across the Atlantic to the UK. She then transmigrated to Canada, returned to Trinidad, and eventually returned to Canada again, all between the 1950s and the 1980s. The surprising connection to Mennonites is that her story was gathered by the Multicultural History Society of Ontario, and it sits in their collections alongside a series of stories you may have encountered of Low German Mennonites who came to Ontario in the 1970s. So we can see again, these experiences, while distinct of course, reveal common patterns of, we could say, radical or extreme mobility across space by a number of migrant communities. And we can attend to the specific questions these raise for all of these migrants: Puerto Rican, Trinidadian, Mennonite, intergenerational challenges, experiences of outsiders, linguistic struggles, and the enduring appeal of both return and the investigation of new opportunities as they emerged. The scholar Devi Mays, who writes about the Jewish diaspora, has referred to this as hypermobility, defined as sustained long-term nonlinear migrations that lack a clear teleology. In defining hypermobility in that way, Mays captures almost exactly the words of a 1980s report by an organization that would take on an outsized role with Mennonites arriving to Ontario from Latin America. The Ontario Mennonite Immigrant Advisory Committee was established by MCC as part of its Canadian Concerns program in the late 70s to address the needs of an increasingly large number of Mennonites arriving from Mexico that lacked proper citizenship documentation. We probably know that under the guidance of Bill Janzen and others, they managed to open the path to citizenship for about 100,000 Mennonites from Latin America. And the organization OMIAC's mandate expanded to various forms of what we might consider in the Canadian context newcomer assistance, right? Advocacy about housing, working conditions, education, and health. In the report I just mentioned, OMIAC refers to the challenges linguistic, intergenerational, and cultural faced by Mennonites from Latin America and suggests, just like that definition of hypermobility, that some Mennonites move back and forth between Mexico and Canada as if they belong nowhere. Staffed primarily by Canadian Mennonites who saw a sort of ethno-religious duty to assist arriving brethren and devoted themselves dearly to that cause, the Canadian Concerns program and OMIAC also reflected another persistent diasporic trend, the sense among a long-established, one could say highly acculturated, portion of a diaspora that a newly arriving migrant wave might somehow compromise or upset its own status, something that I think Luann Good-Gingrich has written quite a lot about in the Ontario context. In accessing and responding to the perceived vulnerability of Mennonites returning to Canada from Latin America, at sometimes in quite desperate conditions, OMIAC also spoke of fostering acculturation, equivalent to sort of ideas about newcomer outreach. The same report I mentioned above indeed contains a reference to children quickly adapting Canadian practices, often to the bewilderment of their parents. Well, my preliminary interviews with those who arrived in Canada from Mexico as children in the 70s and 80s do point to many of these intergenerational tensions over youth adoption of Canadian customs. The idea that acculturation was to be an inevitable result of settlement in Canada for Latin American Mennonites, who might go back and forth a few times before settling permanently, was much more complex, especially as the communities in Ontario and other places grew. By the 1990s, when Mennonites from Mexico had been returning to Canada temporarily and permanently for several decades, economic uncertainty around NAFTA and drought in Mexico expanded the scope of this migration, resulting in an increasing number of new arrivals. This much is evident in OMIAC reporting on Mexico. Here we have a report from Marvin Duick from 1995 about some of the factors pushing new rounds of migrants north. It's also evident in OMIAC's highly detailed reports about increasing populations in Southwest Ontario, and increasing numbers of newcomer families. So here are some of the key destinations we might be familiar with: Leamington, Elmer, and others, and the yearly arrivals here for 93 through 95, with broken down for Mexico by state or by country for other locations. So the question I wanted to ask, thinking about this North economic, South religious dichotomy, is what was really taking place in Southwest Ontario and other Latin American Mennonite destinations in those years. These were small Canadian and US towns and regions in Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, Kansas, and Texas that would have otherwise likely seen modest or non-existent population growth in the 1990s. And they were now home to multi-generational Latin American Mennonite communities. Indeed, these were some of the places in Canada that had the largest concentration of folks born in Latin America of anywhere in the country. Perhaps these places reflected not old models of settlement and acculturation and related language loss or assimilationist ideas that Mennonite leaders of the 1920s had feared when they confronted school conflicts, but rather one of a consolidating Latin American Mennonite presence, a continued use of Low German, and a growing number of Low German-owned Mennonite businesses and occupations far beyond the traditional sort of stereotypical field and greenhouse work. Places like Winkler, Elmer, Tabor, Seminole, and liberal Kansas demonstrated a persistent transnationalism, even among those who might have decided to settle permanently or were born in those new regions in Ontario, but found their family lives, their businesses, and social world deeply connected to contemporary events throughout the Latin American Mennonite world. They began, in short, to look less and less like the abandonment of a dream of the 1920s, and more like a form of that dream reconstituted as a unique node within this expanding Latin American Mennonite diaspora. And I have a couple more slides which didn't fit into the talk, but maybe are appropriate. One, of course, from the Daily Bonnet, Mennonite man moves back and forth between Canada and Mexico a record 37 times in a single week. That certainly fits within the definition of hypermobility. A pizza menu, right, from the well-known Thiessen pizza chain. As a fellow Thiessen, I had to put this up here. The Manitoba recipe, and the pizza recipe as a whole, was apparently gained over a period of time spent working in Canada, where the secrets of Canadian pizza were brought back to Chihuahua. And of course, Plaza Ontario, sitting there out on the commercial corridor outside of Ciudad Cuauhtemoc in Chihuahua. So thanks for your time. I appreciate any questions you might have.
All right, so I was told I can start speaking and then it will appear, like magic. I have a little bit of a cold, so forgive me if I start coughing during the presentation. Like so. So my title is Climate Violence and the Mennonite Migration from Mexico to Colombia. So I didn't actually know how to start this presentation because every other time I've done a presentation on the Mennonites and Mennonite history, I've just spent about 5 to 10 minutes to explain how German-speaking Russian Anabaptists with Dutch last names and Canadian passports end up in northern Mexico. And since I don't really have to do that to this crowd, I can just kind of cut a good 10 minutes of my presentation out. Okay, so in 2015, a lot of Mennonites from Mexico have been migrating to the llanos, or the grasslands of eastern Colombia. So I'm arguing that the primary reason for this new migration is due to climatic pressures rather than religious or economic reasons. So these are all pictures of the new colonies. They're growing lots of rice, is the top right corner. They have a lot of irrigation canals. They have silos. So they're a very conservative group, but they still also use tractors. And so that's a picture of in the middle of one of the new houses. So they're very well built, tiny, tidy houses, and they all have connections with electricity. So this is just the general pattern. Most of you know Russia, North America to Latin America. Okay, so I'm gonna use a lot of maps in my presentation because I'm a map person. I like maps. So this is just the general area where a lot of the Mennonite colonies are in northern Chihuahua. So just pinpoint that, and then you'll see what I'm gonna do in the next map. So notice the North American Drought Monitor, where the most intense parts of the drought in the Americas are. So a lot of it overlaps of northern Mexico, southwest US, northern Mexico, Sonora, Chihuahua. These are what they're even calling a mega drought that hasn't been seen in 1,200 years with the problems of rainfall and lack of rainfall. And this is a 2011 map, and it's even gotten worse. So how does climate change work? Climate change acts mostly as a catalyst. So these are regions that are obviously always going to have sort of drought, flood, back and forth patterns. But what climate change does is it makes it more, it intensifies it. So when it's a drought, it's even drier. If it does flood, it's even wetter. And this creates a circular problem in the soil composition, where the soil now, it becomes so dry that it doesn't retain water. Evaporation is accelerated, so all of the water absorption in the soil, it evaporates. So it's increased aridification in these regions. That's the main concern of climate change. So these are always going to be regions that will you have to be conscious of water usage, but climate change is making it almost irreversible. So a couple things to note. So food production across Mexico, because of this drought, has been decreasing and on the decline. The Tarahumaras are the indigenous group of northern Mexico. There was a story circulating in the news cycle in the past couple of years of a mass suicide of Tarahumaras because of food scarcity. So the state denies that it actually happened, but I haven't verified yes or no, but it did go through the news cycle. So if nothing else, this shows the desperation in people's minds of what they're thinking about the worries of the droughts. So overuse of water. So how does this fit in? So Chihuahua has lots of underground aquifers that have lots of water that have been tapped since the 1980s. 15 of them are dangerously overexploited. Tom Berry, one journalist, is saying that right now we know of northern Mexico as having lots of violence due to drug warfare and cartel violence. He's saying in the future, in 20 years, it's going to be primarily over water. And we already are starting to see this scale sliding in that direction. There has already been death due primarily to climate activists being assassinated. Mennonite control. So when I sent this to Ben, he's like, I think there's a misprint. It can't possibly be 526 million hectares. And so that's probably true. I'm just quoting, that's what it says in the source, but it's probably just a misprint of 526,000 hectares. The idea is the same, though. There's a large bit of land under Mennonite control, and they are primarily using lots of irrigation since the 1980s and using up all of the very little bit of water in the aquifers and little bit of water that's decreasing due to decrease in annual precipitation of rainfall. They're overusing it. They've extended it too far. And the Mennonites in the region are the largest consumers. Now, this has come up to lots of conflict with a group called the Los Barzanistas. So these are farmer activists who are arguing that the Mennonites are using too much of their share of the water supply for pretty much a fair argument, actually. A lot of the Mennonites have a practice of over-drilling, and they're getting too many permits for it. So in the Mennonites' defense, the governments are giving them permits. The Barzanistas are saying, well, that's because you're paying the government official to give you a permit because the system's corrupt. You just give them some money under the table. And that's probably also true, but that's also probably just true because that's the system that, unfortunately, that's how it works there. So this is lots of conflict between the Barzanistas, the communal farmers in the region, and the Mennonite farmers who have these large-scale private property farms. So the Mennonites have used up 80% of the total water reserves. So this is where violence. So Alberto Fernandez, he was a retired politician. He was protesting a lot of the illegal wells. So in 1 year, I think in 2015, in fact, over 500 illegal well permits were given. So he was protesting that, and he was shot dead in 2015, the same year that the Mennonites ended up leaving northern Chihuahua. And he's not the only one. There's quite a list of every couple of years these activists being assassinated. So this also follows a trajectory of Mennonites, like we've been talking about, coming and going out of Canada, out of Mexico. Mennonites going to Belize because of disagreements with the government. going to Paraguay, going to Bolivia, going to Campeche. But this is a different migration, at least that's what I'm arguing. The migration to Colombia is primarily, or a large factor in it, is due to water scarcity because of climate change. So how did they hear about Colombia? Apparently it was just providential. This has also just been a rumor I've heard in a couple different sources. One Mennonite was going across the border in Texas to buy some agricultural machinery. He met a Colombian petroleum engineer somehow who suggested, hey, you have a lot of problems in Mexico. You should come to Colombia where we have lots of farmland and there's plenty of water. So 2014, Mennonites send a delegation to Colombia. They find it very satisfactory. 2015 is when they actually make the move. So this is just a little map of Colombia. Meta is, culturally, it's very similar to Texas, Chihuahua. It's like cowboy culture. Most of the land has been ranches historically rather than large agricultural farmlands. And so this is just the state they're in. So Meta, you notice, it's kind of almost in the exact middle of the country. And they're in kind of on the far side of it. So geographically, Bogota is the capital. That's in the little mountain range. So that's kind of bisects the country in the middle. And then all of eastern Colombia are these low flatlands. All of Colombia gets a fair amount of rain. And then you see the new Mennonite colony right there on that river, the Meta River that flows from the Andes into the plains. So Puerto Gaitan is the port on the river, and then about an hour outside of Puerto Gaitan is the new colonies. And so it's only about a 4-hour drive from the capital. So they are still very close to the market. They're not exactly looking for isolation in this instance. Okay, so 2015, they bought 3 large haciendas, Livni, Australia, and La Florida, approximately 90 kilometers outside the city of Puerto Gaitan. So it's obviously much more rural, but again, it's not very isolated. There are roads that come all the way to the village that they're outside of. These are the basic sectors of the new colonies. So the original 3 were 2015. Since then, they've established 3 more colonies. So as of 2022, there are 6 colonies total. And they're all they're not necessarily side by side, but they're all kind of grouped together in close proximity. And they're still looking for new land to buy within that same region. One of the big reasons that they apparently have decided with Colombia to choose for Colombia, besides just the rainfall, is they can buy large tracts of land. So they're buying these old ranches that used to just have lots of cows that these old large-scale landowners, the elite of Colombia, are owning and selling to the Mennonites because they can buy this large ranch and then break it up into smaller farms for all the families. So in the news, when they are describing the main reason for their migration, Raymond Dyke, one of the leaders of the Livni colony, I believe, he says, "Acá hay agua." So here there's water. So the emphasis on finding some place where there's water that they can still grow and still be farmers is throughout this timeline. So it's also been very beneficial on the Colombian side. They've had a lot of support from the Congress and from the governor of Meta and the mayor of Puerto Gaitan. They've imported lots of machinery, $2.5 million worth of machinery and equipment. In fact, still in the colonies, at least when I visited them in 2020, you would just find empty shipping containers, just like in the corner, just left there. So they really just came and started working. And then they've also established 3 separate agro-businesses. So Florida Farming, which actually has a YouTube channel, if you would like to check it out. He shows all his little farming and irrigation, what he's growing. He's kind of using that as a promotional tool, I think, to try and get more people from Mexico to come to Colombia. And he does also emphasize that there's rain and there's water in several videos. Agroindustrial Llanos, La Esperanza. Llanos is just the name for the plains, so cowboy, like llanero just means cowboy in that region. And Agricola ends. So they're primarily growing, right now they're growing corn as far as I know. They tried rice, they tried soy, but corn is the one that has been given the best returns. They've also had some experimentation with cotton. So they're really bringing a lot of the agricultural knowledge that they've already gained in Mexico to the region. Crops. So one problem, even though there is water, is the soil is not necessarily the same type of soil that they're used to in Mexico, so they've had to reconfigure the composition of the soil by adding calcium in order to really get a successful crop. But all of this has led to problems of its own. So several Colombian environmental groups, including Manga Bay, which is a regional environmental group, is complaining about the Mennonite activities. So the soil calcification, it makes it more difficult for the crops and plants that are indigenous to that region to now grow because it changes the soil composition. They're clearing a lot of ancient forests. The irrigation that they've set in and the pesticides and the chemicals they're using, fertilizers they're using, is now getting into the water supply. And downstream, there's a lot of indigenous communities that are now no longer able to fish from that water supply because a lot of the fish are dying out because of all of the pollutants. So the Sikuna, one of their big complaints, pretty much what I just described, we live from hunting and fishing. The Mennonites are very close to the canals. The water is contaminated and the fish don't return. We have to take water from these streams that are dying up. It's also important to note that Colombia is, I think, the first or the second country in the world with the highest amount of assassinations of climate activists and environmental activists. People like this are, they call them in Colombia líderes sociales, social leaders, but it's all these type of activist groups that are constantly in danger of being assassinated, not necessarily from the government, but from a lot of paramilitary groups that are still active in the area. So Meta is relatively safe, but there's still just the legacy of Colombia with lots of violence of the FARC. Like, I'm sure many of you have read the news of Colombia's long history with FARC and lots of the drug problems, but also a lot of paramilitary groups in the area that are somewhat allowed by the government, even though they're technically illegal. They kill a lot of social activists. So there's a lot of problems in the area, even if it is not technically a red zone. So this is the development of it. If you can look at the map, it's a little hard from this angle, but this is one of the colonies. That's very impressive, but in a way it's also very indicative of the amount of water you can actually see that they're going to be using if it's all this new farmland. So, conclusions. I think this case study kind of shows the nuance of this idea of climate refugee. So are they actually refugees or are they migrants? How do we conceptualize this? I think that maybe the refugees are the ones who can't afford, they don't have the capital to make these types of moves. But I think this complicates the conversation. And then just the interconnectedness of environmental issues. There's no escaping environmental problems. You're gonna have problems in Mexico, in Canada, in the US, and then if you go somewhere else, it's gonna happen again. So migration may not be the way out, rather than dealing with it in the place you're at. So these aren't necessarily nice conclusions, but I think these are things that we need to start thinking about. So, thank you.
thank you all so much for paying attention to our excellent panelists. We have about 25 minutes for questions before it's time for coffee break. And so, as I said in the beginning of the panel, you can ask questions in English or Spanish, and I will translate the questions if they're for our first two panelists, and I will also translate or interpret their answers for you. So we had a presentation on railways and the press, about diplomatic paperwork, and then the third presentation was about what, in fact, is motivating migration, if it's religion and economy, 37 migrations in 1 week. And the presentation that ended our panel was about climate as a motivator for migration. And so hopefully that jogged your memory and jogged your memory for all the questions that you wanted to be asking. And there will be people coming around with microphones. And then at some point, someone will read the questions that are coming in on Zoom.
I guess I'll start it off. Thiessen. I want to thank the three panelists who've traveled further distances for highlighting the really close connection between imperialism and capitalists and how cozy Mennonites are with the imperialists and the capitalists. That's not where my question is, though. I'm not surprised by that. I'm going to go more local and ask Ben if his work has led him to explore specifically here in southern Manitoba how that constant migration has played out in the communities. And particularly, I mean, I'm asking this question as someone who grew up going to school in Altona in the 80s and 90s, where the Mexican Mennonites were in and out, and how does that community constitute southern Manitoba? And how is, I'm wondering if you've done some work on that already, and particularly in how that ended up. I'm curious at how that sort of has not established new religious conservatism in Mennonite models, but has played into other styles of conservatism in southern Manitoba. I don't know. I'm just curious what you've already studied here.
Great, thank you for that that question. Yeah, no, I think the work that I'm doing for this new research project aims to look in kind of a comparative way at processes as they develop in Chihuahua as well as in Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. But I've mostly done the work currently in Southwest Ontario. And so one speculation that I have, or one avenue that I'm interested in exploring, is what it means for returning migrants to either return to a region like Ontario, in which was not the region, if we think of the Centennial they had departed from, but in which there was an established Russian Mennonite population that was often some of the folks that were working as part of OMIAC that worked alongside them, as opposed to actually returning to the very regions that they had left earlier. And so my sense is that outcome is very different. And then, or to a third region, to Alberta, where we don't have that same sizable established population, and where about 40,000 people, I think, as Abe Janzen would say, have probably returned there since the 2000s. And so, on one hand, perhaps we would expect a greater familiarity and direct familial connections in this return to southern Manitoba, as opposed to sort of like a outreach to fellow brethren, but with a completely different migratory trajectory, and that likely determine the outcome. But as far as the work in southern Manitoba, that's what I'm interested in exploring next. And also, of course, the different types of labor that are going on. The initial labor draws, as we could see from the mention I had of the Wall family, and he was coming up for obviously more skilled work as a trade, but primarily things like sugar beets being a significant drawer into southern Manitoba. And I guess one factor that I think is noteworthy there is when we consider labor pools for sort of stoop labor in the fields. You have Mennonites often working in the same fields as Indigenous laborers that are sort of actively, sometimes aggressively recruited from northern communities and brought down either from Saskatchewan or northern Manitoba to work in those fields.
Oh, and one thing before the next person asks the question, if you could identify yourself before you ask your question, that'd be great.
Hi, Gladiola Killer, and this question is just sort of a piggyback, I guess, off the last one for Ben. So the argument that you presented from Ray Lowen about the north-south dichotomy tracks. I am originally from Paraguay, but I was part of the mass exodus in '83 that came here for economic reasons. So I guess my question is, a lot of your focus is on people that have resettled in smaller communities. Now, how does that work when they settle in larger city centers like Winnipeg? And is that going to be a future focus as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you so much for that. It's sort of a blind spot when you take the easy approach to doing sort of migratory or diasporic research. You tend to go to these places where you expect to find your migrants, and I think in an urban context, right, it's quite possible for returning Mennonites to potentially sort of like escape the sort of ethno-religious community and move into an urban location and have a very different sort of outcome than they might when they're sort of very present in large numbers in a relatively small town. So that portrait would look almost completely different, I would imagine.
Hi, I'm Abigail Carl Clausen. Y tengo una pregunta para Arnoldo y María sobre la relación entre los movimientos de los campesinos y la ley de ejido y el proyecto federal de la migración de los Mennonitas en México.
So this question is for Arnoldo and María, and it is about the relationship between the Mexican federal government's assistance for Mennonite migrants at the same time as the Mexican government was starting the ejido or land redistribution program for Mexican peasants.
Ok, sí. Durante el tiempo que estuve haciendo el programa de maestría, me tocó mucho mirar ese problema que había entre los campesinos locales y las políticas contrarias del gobierno federal de Álvaro Obregón y del gobierno del estado.
And so while he was doing his master's program, it often came up in research the conflict between what the federal government was doing and the state government trying to foster the ejidos.
Durante un tiempo, el gobierno del estado estuvo muy de acuerdo con poner un programa agrícola de pequeña propiedad, pero ese programa era muy diferente al del gobierno federal. Y los campesinos, la lucha de ellos quedaban en el intermedio.
And so the state government had a program to foster private property, and this was against the federal government's program for land redistribution or land reform. And what really happened is that people were kind of caught in between the two systems.
Pero hay que tomar en cuenta que los campesinos venían de hacer una revolución en México y ellos habían sido el actor fundamental de esa revolución. La tierra había sido la causa de esa revolución. Pero ellos tenían un papel muy importante en la vida real. En la política no eran muy tomados en cuenta, porque en México la política todo el tiempo se ha hecho desde arriba.
And
no
so,
Perdón.
And so we have to keep in mind also that Mexican peasants were just coming out of the revolution, and they had played a crucial role in this. And land was also one of the two main causes of the revolution. At the same time, the Mexican government does not care about these people, and most decisions are really made at kind of a high level, really ignoring peasants.
De tal manera que los campesinos se organizaron a través de una estrategia de llevar directamente los reclamos con el general Álvaro Obregón. Y hay muchos documentos en el Archivo General de la Nación, muchísimos, y en el archivo, en la Hemeroteca Nacional también hay muchos documentos muy importantes donde habla de la gestión que hacían los campesinos a través de un representante que se llamaba Belisario Chávez. Y él tenía una presencia muy fuerte en la región y él contactó mucho tiempo a la oficina de la presidencia para mirar por su lucha.
And so we can see in the Mexican National Archives and the National Archives that are of like newspapers and magazines that the Mexican peasants were also always trying to negotiate with President Álvaro Obregón. That's the same president who invited Mennonites to Mexico. And so you can read about this, and their main agent, Belisario Chávez, who was negotiating on behalf of Mexican peasants. Creo que más o menos.
Y el
vamos bien.
problema no era tanto con los colonos menonitas, el problema era con los dueños de la hacienda Zuluaga. La hacienda Zuluaga tenía un abogado que se llamaba Guillermo Porras, un abogado muy, muy influyente en la Ciudad de México, y él era un consejero directo para la política de Álvaro Obregón y de la familia Zuluaga.
¿Y cómo es que se llamaba ese abogado?
¿Porras? ¿Guillermo Porras?
Porras?
Sí.
And so the main problem was not actually with the arrival of the Mennonites, it was with what was happening on the Hacienda Zuluaga. In Chihuahua, that's the land where like the Manitoba colony of Mennonites is located now. That's my addition for you. And their lawyer, Guillermo Porras, who was very prominent in Mexico City, like this was on behalf of the Zuluaga family, so that was kind of the main, that was more of the problem.
Ya para finalizar, fue necesario que Álvaro Obregón interviniera directamente y mandara un comisionado a Chihuahua para que él hubiera en este problema entre campesinos y Hacienda Zuluaga, donde estaban inmiscuidos las comunidades que iban llegando, los menonitas. Y una causa de que muchas familias menonitas quisieran regresarse para atrás fue que había un clima donde no estaban muy contentos los campesinos, pero no era tanto por la inmigración menonita, sino porque la familia Zuluaga no quería reubicarlos en la tierra donde ellos habían vivido antes.
And so there's a large conflict that results, that's primarily with the Zuluaga family, and Álvaro Obregón, the president, had to send somebody especially like as his representative to resolve that. And this was happening as the Mennonites were arriving in that place. And it had to do with which part of the hacienda was, era como un ejido. Ajá, era como un ejido que el gobierno le había. And so the federal government had said, this land you need to redistribute it as an ejido, but the family didn't want to do that. Shocking, they didn't want to lose their money. Again, that's my editorializing. But yeah, the real problem was with the president and the way these processes were happening.
My name is Peter Rempel. Maybe as a preface to my question, I would say I've worked for Mennonite church agencies all my life, and I've been wondering about the role of the church leaders in all of these movements. I'm thinking about this in terms of the birth rates that Bruce talked about, and about the Han and Tridge, where Mennonite church leaders were maybe complicit in sending people to a place that was not suitable, and then were they then the resistors to the return, or the welcomers? Did they just tag along? And I'm thinking here, were they part of a diplomacy relationships with Mexico? Are they part of this perpetual motion or permanence? And are they part of the move to Colombia? Are they leaders in that, or are they just tagging along? Where are the church leaders in all of these movements?
And so
How have they changed?
I think this question can be for everyone, so I'll translate it. Pues, ¿cuál es el papel de los líderes de la iglesia en todo eso? Eso era, según él, como en todos los acontecimientos, tanto en la llegada a México, que pueden contestar ustedes, como a Colombia y como los movimientos que mencionó Ben. Entonces, todos ustedes pueden contestar. ¿Cómo gustan?
I can start. So as far as I know, they're in the movement, but they're not leading it. It's primarily led by people thinking more about in terms of the farming aspect of it. So they actually did, I didn't mention this in my talk, but they did get the privileges like they normally do. But importantly, they did not even ask for control over their religious education, and they did not ask for a refutation of the swearing of oaths. The primary request was that they are they don't have to take part in the draft for the military. But besides that, the normal litany of privileges that have to do with the religious aspect of it, they were not concerned with. It was mostly to do with the taxes, exemption of import taxes, things like that. So I would say another reason why I would say that this migration is primarily due to climate pressure rather than religious motivation.
Y sí, por si hay algo que decir.
Ok, quiero hablar algo. Cuando los menonitas llegaron a México, el país estaba como, ¿ustedes han mirado una parrilla cuando echan carne asada?
So when the Mennonites arrived in Mexico, it was like if you've ever seen a grill, like for carne asada, like beef, like it's all kind of laid out.
Ajá. El país nuestro estaba en una evolución política, económica, social, muy impresionante.
And so Mexico had just experienced or was in the middle of experiencing a political, economic, and social revolution.
Y había algo que el general Álvaro Obregón, él sabía, porque yo estuve estudiando en la licenciatura, hice mi tesis sobre el pensamiento y la manera sociológica en que Álvaro Obregón no era tanto un político, él era un pragmático, él era un empresario.
And so he had researched previously Álvaro Obregón in the middle of this situation. He was very pragmatic, not political, and he was business-minded.
Y su bisabuela había tenido una formación, que era de una tendencia muy fuerte católica protestante, su bisabuela.
And so his great-grandmother was Protestant, and so that might also have had something to do with it.
Y la herencia, el pensamiento de Álvaro Obregón que él tenía, él estaba muy dado a valorar considerablemente las personas que tenían una ética y una conducta aceptable. Él no confiaba en muchas personas y hasta cierto punto es comprensible inmigrantes que pudieran venir de otro país. Les soy honesto.
And so he didn't trust many people. ¿Qué más?
Él estaba muy enfocado en darle refugio a inmigrantes que tenían un entendimiento, una cultura.
And so he was really focused on welcoming migrants who had a really specific type of focus.
Y cuando los líderes menonitas fueron y se entrevistaron con él quedó gratamente impresionado con aquella impresión que recibió de ellos.
And so when the Mennonite leaders came and spoke with him, he was extremely impressed with them, and they left a really good impression on him.
Y las autoridades eclesiásticas en ese entonces jugaron un papel fundamental para impactar la visión que tenía el general Álvaro Obregón, y su sobrino es su maestro que vive en Francia, su sobrino tercero, y él nos ha hablado mucho del impacto que él recibió acerca de la delegación menonita y del provecho que le podían llevar al país la cultura protestante.
And so at that time in Mexico, the ecclesiastical authorities from the Catholic Church had a really big influence on the country, but he had met these people and he spoke about them with his nephew and in France, and he really thought that a Protestant outlook would help improve the country. And so
Y Plutarco Elías Calles era antirreligioso, él era espiritista.
And so, like, this was an anti-religious context, and he was a spiritualist.
Él era el siguiente presidente. Y Álvaro Obregón habló con él, habló con los generales, y él les dijo de lo importante que era este grupo de cristianos, protestantes, para traer no solamente progreso a la región, sino para traer una imagen positiva para este punto histórico del pueblo mexicano.
And so he spoke about this, like, with the incoming next president, that this group of people, and I think we might need to switch to Zoom after this so we don't forget about those people, that they would really bring something important to the country.
Pero era muy importante la visión religiosa, el concepto de religión que tenía de los menonitas el presidente Obregón, y creo que eso ha sido fundamental también ante la opinión pública mexicana, porque ellos, a través de ese concepto que han dado las iglesias, que hablan de la paz, que hablan de la no interferencia, que hablan del respeto, han tenido una aceptación en medio de una agenda social en México muy turbulenta ya.
Y ya creo que tenemos que pasar a la siguiente pregunta. But that these churches and talking about about pacifism and non-resistance have had a really important contribution to the country. Oh, okay. Cool. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yes. Yeah, I think just, I was like, who asked the question to begin with? But yeah, in response to your excellent question, I think that that back and forth sort of oscillating movement, between Bolivia or Mexico and Canada, sort of had a high cost in the sense that the returnees, if they spent some time working up north for wages and then came back, often had to make things right with the religious leadership. But it didn't have that rupture, I guess, in this context, the way that Ernie discussed in the Paraguayan context. So it was a bit different. And then it became even more different with the sort of construction or constitution of the Old Colony Church in Ontario, right, as sort of the largest recipient of these arrivals. So once again, I think the idea that this wasn't an abandonment of a dream or a rupture in the way that it was framed becomes particularly true when there's sort of a vibrant Old Colony Church in Ontario that these members can join. But I think the other interesting question is for those that conceive of their migration as a break from that and end up moving into evangelical churches with or without specific Mennonite names attached to them as part of the migration. So that's another issue that I think is important.
And now your question.
My name is Esther Eptison. I thank all the presenters. I have a question for Maria. I was very interested to learn that the Mexican government was so active in recruiting immigrants.
Y pues me interesaba mucho saber que el gobierno mexicano, pues entiendes, ¿no? Sí, quizás haya atraído tantos migrantes.
So I am interested to know, were there other groups, other ethnic groups, other religious groups from the US or Canada or elsewhere that came to Mexico in addition to the Canadian Mennonites?
Y pues sí habían grupos canadienses, estadounidenses, de otros lugares que vinieron en el mismo momento, como que llegaron los menonitas, o como el mismo tipo de negociaciones.
Era muy importante. Estuvimos en la biblioteca allá en México.
Ajá.
Todo lo que es inmigración, todo, sacamos un historial totalmente grande de todos los inmigrantes menonitas, donde tenemos fotografías, tenemos fechas, tenemos nombres, y todo eso está aquí en lo que es el recibimiento de parte de aduanas, en lo que es el traslado de los que llegaron. Y allí Obregón es el que tomó iniciativa a que formaran las familias parte de México. Nos hicieron que se residenciaran.
And so, ya ni me acuerdo de cómo empezaste. So doing research in the Mexican National Library, you can see all of the paperwork from all of the Mennonite migrants and like all of the information about them and how much the Mexican government wanted this specific group to come to Mexico. Y pues habían otros que tenían el mismo tratamiento en ese momento como el gobierno hacia los menonitas, o... No, I asked a follow-up question about if there was other groups.
Fue una política muy excluyente del gobierno mexicano.
It was a very exclusive political treatment.
Sí. Sin mencionar otras cosas. Sí.
A lo mejor. Yeah, maybe we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hola, buenas tardes. Patricia Islas de la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez en Chihuahua, México. Quisiera preguntarle al último ponente si sabe en su investigación si algunas de las familias que emigraron de Cuauhtémoc a Colombia se han tenido que regresar debido a la violencia generada por las FARC en Colombia.
And so this is a question for Sam about the people who went from Cuauhtémoc to Colombia, if any of them have had to return to Mexico because of violence in Mexico. And this is Patricia Islas from the Autonomous University of Ciudad Juárez in Chihuahua. Yeah, so leaving violence in Colombia and returning to Mexico for safety.
Yes, yes.
So, not to my knowledge, most of the trouble they've had has been more legal issues with the indigenous groups and with environmental groups. There have been some, I actually interviewed someone in Almer who was getting help from the MCC who had actually tried, he had gone to Colombia, but then his farm had failed. And so then he was in Canada working for the summer to build up capital to then go back to Colombia to try again. So most of, I think, the returnees have been primarily due to farm failures and then going back to Mexico or Canada to rebuild capital to then return to do another colonization effort. But a lot of the fighting has been primarily for legal issues. I haven't read anything in terms of the violence of FARC. That region is not really, so they also kind of went in at an interesting time in Colombian history where the government was working towards a peace deal in 2016. And then the peace deal fell through, and then they did a reiterated version of it. But that was primarily with FARC. There's several other violent groups, but as of right now, the zone that they're in is a relatively safe zone. There are regions in Colombia that are considered red zones that they say don't go into because that's controlled by paramilitary or FARC or drug-related groups. But Meta has trouble, but it's not because of that. It's not just legal issues in terms of environmental issues. It's also due to the history of the violence of the country. Claim to titles to land, it's very difficult to determine who actually originally owned the land. So there's some issue that maybe some of the land that they've purchased didn't actually belong to the person who sold it to them. The person just paid an official to make a document that looks official and then sold it to some Mennonites. There's some talk about that, but I haven't actually read anything about any issues that have actually happened in court with that yet.
Para resumir súper brevemente, los problemas han sido legales por quién es dueño de la tierra. Hay gente que fabrica o que manufactura el papeleo para decir que tienen permiso para vender la tierra. Y esa zona de Colombia no es una zona súper problemático con relación a la violencia de la FARC, pero hay otras áreas súper violentas y también llegaron en el momento de como un proceso de paz en Colombia. Y sí tenemos una pregunta más. So we have one more final question, and then it's coffee time.
Tracy Huresca, and Sam, this is actually a follow-up, a nice segue from that. I interviewed a couple of people in very northern Chihuahua who owned land in Colombia, but who hadn't moved yet. And they mentioned that there was a rumor that part of the reason that land had been sold to the Mennonites was part of a government strategy to shift the balance of power between insurgent groups. And I was wondering if you had heard anything about that, and this relates to an earlier question about the kind of role of Mennonites in imperial ambitions and negotiations with local powers.
So I haven't actually heard anything in the Colombian news about that necessarily. There might be some problems with, because there has been claimed from the indigenous groups that some of the land, like some of the forests they've burned down, has been land that was supposed to be slotted for indigenous groups. But that's also, there's legal lawsuits that the indigenous groups are working against the Mennonites. But the Mennonites have a lot of support from the local government, Puerto Gaitán. And so from what I've read, most of it has been, the government and Mennonites have kind of made deals, and it's been kind of smoothed out that way.
Well, thank you all so much for all of your excellent questions, and I hope we can continue this conversation over our coffee break before the next panel. Un aplauso.